always rename it later. Okay, so again, yeah, mass, as we double our mass, we're actually doubling patient exposure. And that's something that as our part of our job, our biggest primary goal of a good rad tech is to get the best quality images using the least amount of exposure. So chapter 16 is going to talk about kVp and how that can actually be utilized to help reduce patient exposure. We know in our interactions in physics, we talked about interactions and the patient. What happens as we're increasing our kVp? What happens to the actual number of x-rays that get through the patient and get involved in image production? More of them will get through if we increase our kVp. So your IR is receiving more radiation, more information is coming through. Does everybody agree with that? We know that mass equals quantity, which means number or intensity of the beam. How many x-rays are being produced directly proportional to the mass that we set. And we can go all the way back to the tube itself and think about what's being controlled. That we have a filament circuit, and that filament circuit is actually where we decide how many x-rays are we going to create by the number of electrons that are going to be released from the filament wire. So when you're studying physics, radiology physics, when you're studying radiology physics, you should always keep all of this in mind. Where am I at in the process, and can I backtrack myself? Although we're talking about patient interaction, we're talking about IR exposure, we still need to go back and remember, where did this start from? We have to go all the way back to the circuit to understand where we're going now in image production. You can never forget it. It all ties together. So what we're doing with our kVp, the chapter starts out on page 249 talking about this, it tells you that as we're controlling kVp, we're actually feeding off of what part of the circuit? The auto, that's right, the auto transformer. So that is part of our overall circuit for the X-ray tube, right? Does everybody remember that? You have to keep all these little components together, and they're talking about this in the very first first paragraph on 249. They're talking about now, what do we do when we're doing with our kilovolts? What does that kilovolt do within the tube? It provides that greater potential, that push. It gives those electrons that extra little bit of energy, not a little bit, it's kilovolts, but it's a huge push to give it that kinetic energy of motion to slam over and hit that anode plate, right? So the kVp is actually the push. So let's think about this. We're still in the tube. kVp is being increased. What's going to happen to the number of x-rays that are being created? Are they going to increase or decrease? Higher kVp will allow the Bremsstrahlung interaction to occur more times. It will break more often, so now we have more x-rays being produced. True? Everybody agree with that? So can we now appreciate the understanding and the fact that kVp does play a part in the number of x-rays being created? By the process that I just said, the Bremsstrahlung interaction is going to have multiple breaks. Each time it breaks, what's created? An X-ray. So if we go higher in our kVp, those electrons have more kinetic energy, so they have more opportunities to break before the energy is depleted. Each time they break, an X-ray is being produced. So with what Dr. Haynes talked about in chapter 15, mass was directly proportional, right? We doubled our mass, we get twice as many x-rays. Well, there's not a true relationship with the number of x-rays that's being created by the increase in kVp. We just know that it happens. And it actually happens. It says it's not a linear response. It's called an exponential response, meaning that there's a huge number of x-rays increase as we increase our kVp.
Hey, Kendall.
Yeah.
Before we get deep off into kVp, can we just say the last thing about mass, about the quiz?
Okay, what do you want to say?
Y'all, the quiz, we posted the quiz in Moodle because that way it'll grade it automatically and the grades are put there and we don't have to transfer them over because I still haven't transferred the grades from the last quiz. So when we wrap up the lecture today, you will have 24 hours to go in and complete the quiz on chapter 15. And then we'll actually review the quiz on Thursday. And then we're going to do a review over the 4 chapters briefly for the test next week. So I just want to let y'all know that real quick. The quiz available today, and it needs to be completed, and then we'll cover it Thursday.
And that's posted in Moodle. We're not going to.
It's in Moodle, and it's available now.
Yeah, we're not going to be doing the Socratic because we actually have to transfer those grades over, and it's just time consuming for us. So we've changed our thought process on that. So going back to the on page 249, it says that the effects of higher kVp upon the X-ray beam spectrum was fully discussed in chapter 10. Everybody remember the emission spectrum? We had the peak, right? We had the bell-shaped curve. The area underneath the curve itself represented all X-rays of all energies, and that was called polyenergetic. So it included all X-rays. And where was the kVp at? Where was the peak located? The peak was located at the bottom towards the right. So what do we know about kVp? Does all X-rays have that level of energy? When you set your kVp on the console, every X-ray that you create, is it going to have that energy level? No. It's going to have, again, what we call polyenergetic because we can't predict the Bremsstrahlung interaction. Remember, it's unpredictable. So what happens when we increase our kVp, it actually, the amplitude, the highest point of the emission spectrum, that bell-shaped curve, it actually shifts to the right and it gets a little higher. And that little bit of increase in height tells you that there's more X-rays being created by increasing our kVp. Okay? So the primary controller for the number of X-rays being created is quantity, is mass. But kVp plays a secondary effect on the number of X-rays. And that's what this chapter is talking about. Is everybody okay with this? Okay, I'm turning over on page 250. It says sufficient penetration and subject contrast. There's 2 things that we're going to be talking about here, and one is called optimal and minimal kVp. The minimum kVp simply means the kVp necessary to completely penetrate the thickest part of the anatomy. If your kVp has not penetrated the most dense part of a bone, then it's considered underpenetrated. So our primary goal is to use the kVp that is going to sufficiently penetrate the anatomy, the thickest portion of the anatomy, and that is called your minimum. That's the least you can use for that particular body part, that particular exam. You have to ensure penetration. Everybody with me? And that was called the minimum kVp because there's something else that's called optimal kVp coming up towards the end of the chapter. So I want you to know those 2 definitions. It's very important that you understand. You have to ensure minimum penetration. So there is a kVp that would be too low, and you would have something called an underexposed image. And in the digital world, it's called quantum model. It's a speckled, I used to think of it as a robin's egg. You know how speckled looking a robin's egg looks like? It's missing information because not enough energy got through the patient and hit the IR plate. Okay? So the first job of kVp is to ensure penetrability. That's actually its main purpose, is to ensure penetrability. Is everybody with me? And that's kind of what they're talking about when you're looking on page 250 at that figure 16-2. you can walk through that and it helps clarify that concept. But again, I'm not going to go in a lot of depth here because these are already posted and more content in the videos. But just keep in mind that we have to have sufficient penetration in order that we get good subject contrast. So anything under too low of a kVp, what is that going to actually give you? It's going to be an underpenetrated loss of subject contrast. It's just going to be all white. All your x-rays were too weak, so that very few, if any, got through. And remember, the emission spectrum tells us that over 1/3 of the x-rays produced is going to be at 1/3, or the majority of x-rays produced is going to be at 1/3 of the set kVp. So even though you get 1 or 2 through, that's coming from the right side of the emission spectrum where your actual kVp kind of flattens out. You only have a few that's going to actually get through at that set kVp. Does everybody understand? Anybody have any questions? Please ask. I mean, this is really good.
Hey, Kendall,
Huh?
somebody messaged me and said they had a question, and now I can't find it, and I don't know who it was.
Was it a comment?
Yes.
Thank you. Great. I love love the videos. I like the videos. Very informative.
So I think they sent me one individually, and now I can't find it because I'm not
okay. Y'all can
savvy on this iPad.
Y'all can post it over there in the chat side and I can read them.
Yeah.
Or if you want to ask me, please do. I mean, that's what we're here for. Anybody want to ask the question?
Somebody had a question.
Okay, well, if it comes back to you or you feel like you want to ask, please do.
Okay. Okay, they're asking about taking the test.
Okay, well, we're not going to go.
Yeah, we'll talk.
We're not talking test strategies. We're talking kVp. We're going to focus on today. We're not worried about what happens tomorrow. We're not worried about what's on the test next week. We're going to get you there. Again, like I said in my emails, we're all in this together. Don't start trying to drill out test questions on us because that's not going to happen. We're sticking to the content of Chapter 16. We're going to offer you a review Thursday. This is just a waste of our time. This time is set up for Chapter 16, Q&A, and I'm going through the chapter with you. So
excellent.
If you have another question like that, please send them to us privately through email, and we'll be happy to discuss it with you. Okay? I don't mean to sound short, but I'm trying to keep these videos down to a minimum of time, really. So,
because otherwise,
we can't do nothing with them. They're too long. Okay, so is everybody okay with that? Everybody understands what the minimum kVp is. That is the lowest kVp setting possible for a given anatomy to ensure that we have penetration. And everybody understands why kVp will increase the number of x-rays being created, although its primary job is for penetration.
You have 2 questions posted in the chat.
Okay, I thought quantum model was insufficient mass. It is. It is insufficient mass. If you have insufficient mass, the electrons the x-rays are not strong enough to get through. They're still not getting to the plate. So you got to give the optimal kVp to push them through. Now, once you push them through and you have penetration and you no longer have that silhouette image, that's when you can actually increase your mass to get rid of the quantum model. Okay, so you're correct on that. And it says Cameron's asking, what is optimal kVp? Optimal kVp is coming towards the back of the book, Cameron. Right now we're talking about the minimum. Okay, so the minimum simply is the lowest amount of kVp we can use to penetrate a particular body part. And I want you to understand in the PowerPoint, there's a really good picture of the emission spectrum showing you the increase in the amplitude and towards the right side of the bell-shaped curve. That's showing you that more x-rays are being created. And it's not a lot, but we still have to address it. We still have to be cognitive that this does happen, and I want you to understand why is it happening. As we're not changing our mass, we're changing kVp. We're giving it those electrons more energy so they're able to create more Bremsstrahlung interactions, thereby creating more x-rays. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so again, I'm on page 252. This talks about what can we do to compensate for what kVp does as we go higher in our kVp, and it's producing more x-rays. So if we go higher in our kVp and we do nothing, we leave our mass the same, aren't we going to be probably overexposing the patients because we're kept the same mass? We know that the kVp is producing more x-rays. So you got to do something. If we're increasing our kVp, we're going to have, that's creating more x-rays also. We have to do something to mass in order to balance it out. That's right, Laney. We have to bring, mass has to go down. So for the balance, the kVp is going to be adjusted up or down by 15%. And that equals either a doubling or a half of the original mass. And that will give you the same output from the tube. Okay, that's what the 15% rule tells us, that we can actually change our kVp by 15% up or down. And whatever we do in one direction with kVp, if we go up in our kVp, we're going to go down in our mass by, we're going to half it. If we're going up going down in our kVp, we're going to double our mass. So it says in the book by a factor of 2. That simply means either a doubling or a half, depending on what direction you go in your kVp. If you're increasing your kVp or decreasing your kVp, you're going to do the opposite of the mass. Either you're going to double it or half it. As you go lower in your kVp, you're going to double your mass. As you get higher in your kVp by 15%, as you get higher in your kVp, you're going to reduce your mass by half. So those are both by a factor of 2. It's in the book. I can't remember exactly where it's at. I'm trying not to follow a book. I'm just getting this out from memory here. But does everybody understand why we're implementing the 15% rule for kVp? We're doing that because the increase in kVp will produce more x-rays. So if we go higher in our kVp, we should be doing something to the other technical factor, which is mass, in order to help compensate for the extra x-rays that are being created because of the higher kVp. Any questions? All right. There's a really good video. I worked out some of the 15% rule problems directly from the book. Just remember that you have to do it incrementally by steps. And what does that mean? Okay, say you're going to go from 90. I probably should write it down because I'll forget what I'm saying. Let's just say y'all can write this down with me. Let's just say that we're at 40 mass and we're at 80 kVp. Okay, I want to get the kVp, or let's say I want to get the mass down to 5. Okay, so how many steps is it going to take using the 15% rule to get 40 down to 5? The first thing we'll do is take 40 and we're going to take it down to what? 20, because that's half of 40. So that's one step. So we would add 15% of 80 and we'll get our new kVp. Then the next one, we're at 20 mass. Now we need to half that again, and we're down to 10 mass. So we're going to take our new kVp, and we're going to add 15% to it. That would be another step. And then your final one will be from 10 to 5. So for every step that you do, you're going to have to do the same thing to kVp. But since we're going down in our mass, our kVp needs to be going where? Up. So we step down from 40 to 20, 20 to 10, 10 to 5. That's 3 times. You have to do 3 steps of the 15% rule to get your new kVp. Does everybody understand that? You can't just say, okay, well, 15% times 3 is 45. I'll just take 45% and add it to the original kVp. You can't do that. You have to do it incrementally, each step at a time. So look and see what factors in the questions or the math problems are telling you you're changing, and how many steps is it going to take to get there by a 15% incremental. And just a rule of thumb, most texts think of the 15% rule as 10 kVp. So instead of, if I'm going from 80 and I want to get down to 5 mass, I'm going to add 10. I'm going to say 80 is now 90, 90 is now 100, 100 is now 110 at 5 mass. Now, of course, you're going to want to do the actual math problems, but in the the work environment, that's how technologists do it. So you incrementally are stepping it down 4 times. You're at 80, then you went to 90, you went to 100, then you went to 110. That was 110, and you were trying to get down to 5 mass. But do them step by step. Actually calculate your 15% and add it to your original kVp. Then that kVp is the one that you're going to use. That new kVp will be the one you use for your next step, and so forth. Does everyone understand that? I did some, like I said, part 2, I believe, has that in there. So you can work them out. Please understand the principle behind it. Please understand how to do it. And I'm on page 254. Cameron, this is where we're talking about optimal kVp. And it says, this relates to your modern DR system, your digital imaging. It tells us that the systems themselves like higher energy. So that was a good thing for us, because now we're able to go up in our kVp, and by going 15%, even just one step higher, 15% of the original kVp, if we increase it just by one step, by 15%, we're able to reduce the mass by half, and that actually reduces patient exposure by a half. Okay, so that's a big, huge savings and good preventative over radiating our patient if we start practicing that. And it's pretty cool in your book on page 252, table 16.1, versus the table on page 258, table 16.3. Looking at them, as you can fold the 2 pages together, what do you notice about it? What's going on table 16.3 for the hand versus 16.1? They're on the table 16.1 on page 252 for a hand, they use 54. What are they using on page 258, table 16.3? 64. So they've already implemented a 15% increase in all kVps, and now they've look at your mass. Your mass would actually be half of that. Does everybody understand that? So this is the DR system, and even in positioning, we're trying to teach you guys higher kVp settings, because that's, first of all, it's good for the patient exposure. It helps reduce patient exposure. And second of all, the DR system responds to that higher energy level. It wants more of the x-rays to get through and have some high energy to them, because this is electronics. Electronics like energy. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions? Shakavia, did you work the actual problem out? Is that what you're showing me there? She's got 120. I didn't work it. I just did it mentally in my head. Did anybody work that one out?
I worked it out and got the same answer, but I didn't know if it was right.
121, 122.
I got 121.67.
Yeah.
So yeah, 122.
Yeah, well, you did it correctly. And I just ballparked it. And like I said, incrementally, technologists are not going to stand in the department with a calculator and do that 4 times. They're just going to incrementally drop it by 10 each step and say, okay, I'm at 80. Now I want to get down to 5 mass. So that's going to take me 4 steps. So I'll go 80, 90, 100, 110. That I just mentally did that. And you can do this on a test and look and see if there's an answer that correlates to that. But like Shacavius just did it and Amanda Cloud did it, and they actually got 121, and my high was 110. So for your test purposes, absolutely do the math so that you will get that extra little kVp. But you'll see, like I said, you'll see technologists do this all day long, and we do it in our head. But we're not going to go. We're not going to have a calculator and go with the absolute 15%, because in your book it tells you it's incrementally changes of 10, give or take. But very good job on that, guys. Okay, so we were back on optimal kVp, and I'm on page 254. It says, with modern computer-based imaging systems, that's what you guys will be working on, CRDR. This is considerable flexibility. There is considerable flexibility with high kVp settings can be employed for a particular body part as long as the kVp is above the minimum required to adequate penetration, and the computer can do what? Resolve it to a good image. In our days, when we did that and we used too much kVp, Dr. Haynes, what did we get? We got a blacked image. We called them burned out. There was no computer waiting to come and correct for that mistake. So that's why we never played around with this manipulation going higher in our kVps. It's why it's harder for us as senior technologists to actually grasp this. Of course, as educators, we understand the physics behind it now. You guys, I want you guys to learn the high kVp, and that's all you should know. But understand where it's coming from, because we know the higher kVp changes your scale of contrast. Going up in our kVp by 15%, Shelby, what is that going to do to our scale of contrast? High kVp gives you what kind of scale?
Low contrast.
It's low contrast, so what kind of scale is it?
Long.
It's a long one. So we had to be very careful. We didn't want to stretch our scale out so long that it was nothing but a bunch of light grays. Although there was a little difference between each one of them, there was not enough for the human eye to detect. So we wanted to be careful to not stretch it out way too far. But now it's telling you we can do that because the computer is responsible for setting that contrast and that brightness. It can take very little exposure to that imaging plate, and it can do miracles with it. So when you get in the clinic this summer and you make an exposure, every one of your images look beautiful. And that's photographic wise. They look gorgeous. But, of course, the positioning may be questionable. That's where we're going to work on. But every one of yours is computer corrected. So why not go higher in our kVp, because that's going to help reduce what? Candy, what is that going to help produce as we increase in kVp? What is that doing for the patient exposure?
Increases it.
It does what?
It will decrease the patient exposure.
Substantially, right. So if we go one incremental step up in our kVp, we have just reduced our patient exposure by 50%. So that, I mean, there's no argument there that we should be practicing this today, this summer, and for the rest of your career. You should start using higher kVps. Does everybody understand that? And the 15% rule is allowing you to come up with a new kVp that will still give you what you need. Obviously, you're going to get penetration because you're using higher kVps, but it's telling you what you can do to the mass is doubling or halving it. Most of the time, we're halving it, because as we half it, each step we're reducing that patient exposure by half. Okay, so it says, since I'm on page 255, it says, since the use of high kV low mass technique reduces patient exposure, this is on the first column on page 255. It says, since the use of high kVp low mass technique reduces patient exposure, it is difficult to find any justification or argument for lower kVp settings that barely meet the minimum listed on the table. the advent of this computer-based system has forced radiographers to rethink, that's us, to rethink their definition of what constitutes optimal kVp or recommended kVp for each body part. We will define, Cameron, here's your definition, optimal kVp as a level of kVp well above the minimum. Now remember, the minimum was only that kVp that gave what? Penetration, right? You just ensured penetration at the minimum kVp, but it says the optimal kVp is well above the minimum required for sufficient penetration, but it strikes an appropriate balance between saving patient exposure and preventing excessive scatter. Is everybody on page with that? Everybody good? Any questions? Let's see. So we can increase mass, we increase it. If we increase mass, we increase exposure. No. Okay, that's backwards. So if we increase our mass, we're actually decreasing. I'm sorry, yes. Yes, you said it right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you increase your mass, we increase exposure. That's something that we're not wanting to practice using the 15% rule. We never want to increase mass. We're always working to decrease mass. We're working towards what? Increasing our kVp. That's what we want you to practice. We want you to practice higher kVps, less mass. But yes, as you increase your mass, it's a direct relationship to patient exposure. If you double your mass, you're doubling your patient exposure. That's true.
So I have a question. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Basically, kVp and mass are directly related because kVp increases quality and quantity, but then if you increase the kVp, you decrease the exposure, whereas if you increase the mass, you increase the exposure. Am I understanding you correctly, or did I go too far out?
Where are you? Turn your camera on first of all, so I can find.
Ooh, I look bad. Okay.
Hey,
Can you
what
see me?
sent?
I'm trying to find you here. There you
I'm
are.
here.
Okay, Shakavius. Tell me your answer again. Your question again.
Okay, it's kVp and mass directly proportional because
No.
kVp increases quality and quantity,
Yes,
but they do different things to the exposure.
okay. Let me backtrack one thing. The primary controller for exposure is mass. Mass is quantity. kVp only plays a small part in increasing the number, the increase in the number of X-rays. kVp's primary purpose is penetration.
Okay.
But the downside of that, and then you're reading in the chapter, it's going to tell you this is something we wish wouldn't have happened. We wish as we increased our kVp, the number of X-rays did not increase, but the primary controllers of mass or the number of X-rays is mass, quantity. The quality of the beam, the primary controller of that is kVp. There just happens to be a kind of like a little extra thing that happens as we're increasing our kVp. Yes, the number does go up slightly, but again, if you look in the PowerPoint, there's a great example showing the emission spectrum, and it shows you, I think it's in the PowerPoint, Shakavius, and not in this book. They took it out, but just look at the PowerPoint. I think I discussed this in part one, but you'll see how that bell-shaped curve of the emission spectrum actually it goes up and it shifts to the right a little bit. As it goes up from the original, that tells you that there's more X-rays being created, but not to the point to where you would actually be doubling, like your mass, and you double mass, it goes exactly double the number of X-rays. So there's not really a direct relationship between kVp and mass as far as the production or the quantity of X-rays. I want you to remember mass equals quantity equals number. I want you to remember kVp equals quality equals penetrability.
Hey, Kendall,
Uh-huh.
do you see what Emmy Hines put in the chat?
Increase 15%, half mass, half patient exposure. Mass and patient exposure are directly proportional. Is that right or is that backwards? Increase kVp equals half mass. Yes, that is correct. It was
Sorry, I didn't mean, I forgot to hit send.
Yeah, Emmy, that is completely right. She says increasing your kVp by 15% allows you to reduce your mass by half. So therefore, you are actually reducing patient exposure by half. Mass and patient exposure, and now mass and your patient exposure are directly related. As mass goes up, patient exposure goes up. As mass goes down, patient exposure goes down. That's absolutely right, Emmy.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. I appreciate y'all's answer, y'all's questions over here, so that keeps us going, and you're getting your answers on real time here. Okay, so everyone understand the difference between minimum kVp that only gives you penetration and optimal kVp. Optimal kVp is higher energy level, higher kVp, and that the reason we're doing that we're doing that because we can do the opposite of mass, and we're saving patient exposure. Okay, so higher kVp reduces patient exposure. All right, so I'm flipping over, and it says the impact of scatter radiation on the image. I'm at 36 minutes, Dr. Haynes. Is that okay?
Yes.
I'm gonna try to keep it under an hour. I'm on page is it Alessa Steele, Miss Steele?
Uh-huh.
I don't have a picture of her. Okay, so
Okay.
we're on page 256. Impact of scatter radiation on the image. Again, old world, new world. Old world, we were terrified of scatter. Scatter would literally destroy our image. Okay, now what is scatter, and why are we talking about it in this chapter? We're increasing our kVp, Shelby. Why would we be increasing our kVp? Why
To decrease scatter?
Okay, to decrease scatter, we're increasing as we're increasing our kVp, does scatter actually decrease? It actually goes up. But my thought process here was, why would a person be using more kVp for a particular patient? It's because of the size. We still have to ensure penetration. So the size of the patient, the size of the anatomy is what dictates us using higher kVp, right? So the amount of scatter being created, it's not created from the higher kVp. It's created because that beam now has to go through a thicker body part. So the thicker body part is what prompted us to use higher kVp. It's the thicker body part that allows multiple scattering events to occur. Does that make sense, Shelby? Okay, there's two primary things that increase or encourage scatter, and that is patient size and field view. Your collimated square, your field of view. A larger field of view, you're using more of the beam. That's going to give you more scatter. And the size of the patient. A larger patient, you have to use higher kVp to get to that minimum kVp and then optimal kVp. So we're forced to use higher kVp. It's the size of the patient or the field size that's actually generating the scatter. Okay, so as that x-ray is coming through, it's stronger. It now has more opportunities to cause more constant interactions within the patient, thereby giving you or creating more scatter as we go through a thicker person or a thicker body part. Does that make sense? Why else would we be increasing kVp? All we got to do is ensure penetrability. So obviously, if you get a larger patient, you're going to have to go up in your kVp or a more dense bone. In the book, they talk about the L spine, which I know we haven't covered in positioning. But go back and read that, and it makes sense. If you're doing an AP L spine, then you roll over a patient and you're trying to do an L5S1, is the junction of the lumbar and the sacrum. You have to shoot through the pelvic wings. So there's a lot more bone there. So we have to go up in our kVp to get penetration through a lateral aspect for an L5S1 junction of the L series. Okay. Anybody else got any questions? So it talks about scatter real quick here, and it does say it says it talks about the old school. It's the first. It's in the past concern over effects of scatter and fog in the film restrained radiographers from using high kVp. So that's us. We were terrified, and honestly, your scale of contrast would change with the 5 kVp change in film screen. I mean, we were stuck on our 48 and our 52 for a finger, and I was like, "Oh my God, you used to 57. It's going to be burnt. It's going to that's how sensitive technique was to film screen." And that's what that first paragraph talks about. It was hard for us to let go of that concept and to know that the IR plate now wants that energy. It wants that higher kVp. We never manipulated kVp unless, like what Shelby and I were just talking about, was the fact that we had a larger patient. And we also knew that we needed to go and grab a grid because that patient was going to create more scatter. The thickness of that patient is what produced the scatter, not the higher kVp. The higher kVp, actually, we want to try to get it through the patient so that we have enough of the remnant beam to create an image. Okay? So it says there are two very substantial reasons why this restraint is no longer applies. First, it says the fear of scatter production from high kVp was somewhat exaggerated in the first place. And they use the example on page 257, the elbow and the abdomen. If you look at the elbow, 64 and 94, is there much difference in those two images? And that's a small piece of anatomy. That's an elbow. I can see a change of the scale of contrast because I can see the soft tissue around the elbow getting a little darker, right? So that was the fear that this was put in our heads day one of school, scatter, 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 be scared of scatter and all this. And now in our world, in your world, scatter's not that big of a deal. We're going to tell you later on in the fall, you can forget all you know about scatter because there's algorithms and there's applications built in that remove all your scatter. So it protects your overall exposure to the plate. But for now, and until the registry catches up with all this, you still need to understand scatter and its effect on what the image does. But looking at the abdomen, there was a 80 kVp and a 92, and they actually applied the 15% rule to your kVp. It's 80 kVp, we went up to 92. But look what we did to the mass. We were at 40, and then we halved it. So that figure B is actually being done at 20 and 92. Can you see any major difference? Again, I can see a change in the scale of contrast, but it's not that noticeable. You really have to look hard for it. Okay? So towards the bottom there, it says a lengthening of the grayscale can be seen. This is in the first column on page 256. 256, first column. And towards the bottom, it's talking about those images. It says demonstrating more details in the thickest bones, but no fog is present from the scatter radiation. This demonstrates that high kVp does not bring with it any significant increase in scatter, reaching when the body part is not large enough to produce substantial scatter in the first place. Scatter radiation originates primarily from what? Large body parts and large field size, not from kVp. Make sure you highlight that. That kind of explains it right there for everybody. So it's the body part thickness and it's the field size that's really your two enemies that's going to create the scatter. And it goes on down. It talks about the figure of 16-6 we just talked about it. I'm turning the page over I want to talk a little bit on page, I'm sorry, I'm going to stay on page 256. This is really cool stuff here. This shows you what it actually does to patient exposure and as we're increasing our 15% rule. Let's focus on table 16.2. The first part of it, exposures 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice the first exposure was 70 at 16 mass, right? It gives you an MR reading. That's your entrance skin exposure dose of 146 MRs. Now we're going to do the 15% rule. We're going up in our kVp. So we're leaving 70. We're adding 15% of that to it. We get 81. So what did we do to the original mass of 16? We halved it, right? Okay, so we're at 81 at 8 mass. Look what we got now. We went from 146 down to 98. Now that is a 67% reduction in those two exposures. Now, take away the fact that we reduced our mass by what? Half. So let's take away 50% of that from that 67. That leaves 17% increase in using the higher kVp. Do you see how they did that? Everybody with me? Candy, Ms. Frost, are you okay? Do you understand how to utilize the chart? So what we actually have, we have a 34% of that image is being created by that increase in your exposure. Then the next one, we're going from 81, we added another 15%, and we cut our 8 mass into 4, and now look what we have, 64.5% MRs. That is a 66% decrease in the overall from your previous exposure. You minus the 50% because we reduced our mass by half. That's responsible for a 50% reduction. So taking away 50 from the 66 gives us 16. What percent of 16? What percent of 50 is 16? It's 32%. Does everybody see how that works? You're not going to be responsible for this. This just helps you appreciate why we are trying to encourage the use of the 15% rule. And we can take this all the way down to step number 4 and go as high as 105 kVp. We took that mass of 2 above, we divided it, we halved it to 2. Look how much MR is being read. 41.4 MRs at your entrance skin exposure. That is a 64% decrease again. So take away 50 from that 64, you get 14. That 14% is what is responsible for that increase in the kVp. So your total, if you're looking at your exposures, your percent due to increase, 34, 32, and 28, you average that out. Increasing your kVp one step by 15% actually reduces your patient exposure by 1/3. That is very, very important for you to get that down. And it tells us somewhere, I have it highlighted. It's 1/3 of the original. If anybody find it, let me know. So the difference in contrast is just slightly. The benefit in decrease in patient exposure. That is exactly right. Is it Misa? Where are you at? That is exactly right. The difference in contrast is slightly. So this 15% change in kVp, as we're increasing it, it does increase our scale of contrast just slightly. But the bigger benefit is that we're reducing our patient exposure by half because we're halving our mass. So yes, that is definitely true. Let's see, yes. Okay. Did anybody find in the book where it said overall exposure is reduced to 1/3? Yeah, here it is right here. On page 255, second column, towards the bottom, it's highlighted in black. We conclude that these 15 steps in kVp increase patient exposure, but only by 1/3. That important point for the student to remember is that since having the mass cuts the exposure by 50% first, that's why we were subtracting the 50% from the change. The net result of applying the 15% rule is exposure averaging about 67% of the original. A net savings in the patient is about 1/3. So you're going to reduce your overall exposure from 100%. If you increase your kVp by 15%, you're reducing the overall exposure to 67. So you actually saved the patient the other 1/3. You've reduced patient exposure by 1/3. Does anybody have any questions on that? The last thing I want to talk about, there's some good.
I'm about AT&T to get them to work on my phone.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Never mind.
Okay. So on page 258 on that very first column, it says to top this all off, modern digital processing can easily correct a moderate loss of subject contrast in the remnant beam striking the image receptor. Computer algorithms adjust each image for optimal presentation on the display screen. Only in the extreme loss of subject contrast from scatter radiation will the computer not be able to correct it. So to that question again, the contrast is slightly adjusted, but the computer is going to take care of that for us by us utilizing a higher kVp. Okay, so we're at 51 minutes. I'm going to go 10 more minutes. Anybody have any questions? Any questions at all? Everybody understand kVp? Increasing kVp actually increases the number of X-rays slightly, not as it would be with the doubling your mass. The 15% rule helps us to compensate for that extra X-rays that's being created by our higher kVp, because we can actually continue to up our kVp and we can halve our mass. Remember, when we talk in the departments this summer and I say, Lainey, what did you use? All I want to hear is 40 mass. To me, kVp actually becomes irrelevant because of what this chapter tells us. All we have to ensure is that we have penetration. I want to know, what did you use to expose that patient? Your majority of your exposure comes from what? Mass. So when you're talking to me, I want that technique. I said, what was your technique? 40 mass. That's good. That's what I want to know, because I know what the kVp ranges are for the body part, but I want you to know a good mass technique. So that's how I talk. I talk mass first. So does anybody have any questions? Did this help out? And has everybody looked at the 3 videos yet before this? Candy, does it help? You like it? You want me to keep doing this?
Yes, it broke it down in smaller increments, and I was able to grasp each section a lot better.
And then this today just kind of wrapped it all back up for you, and it wasn't foreign to you because you've already heard it. Very good, very good. All right, guys. So if y'all have no questions at all, I'm going to stop the video so that we can
Do that, and then I have one announcement.
Let me go